Without the power of belief and a positive mindset, Thomas would be doomed. Thomas had set out on a brisk morning walk with no intention of venturing far from home. But fate intervened the moment he decided to explore a narrow, winding trail that he had never noticed before. He moved carefully, drawn by curiosity and the thrill of discovering something new, until the loose ground beneath his feet gave way without warning, sending him tumbling down a steep embankment and into the yawning mouth of a hidden cave. The air was knocked from his lungs as he landed hard on the rough, rocky floor, pain shooting through his right leg and reverberating along his spine. For a few seconds he could only lie there, stunned and breathless, heart pounding as the reality of his predicament sank in. When he finally managed to sit up, his hands shaking with adrenaline, he realized the cavern around him was far larger than he had initially perceived, an immense void of darkness that swallowed every echo. Panicking, he searched for the shaft of daylight he had glimpsed during the fall, only to find that it was now just a faint circle high above, nearly impossible to reach with nothing but the clothes on his back and his will to survive. A terrifying chill seeped into his bones, heightening his sense of isolation as he rubbed his bruised arms and winced at the twinge in his ankle. He tried calling out for help, but the echo of his own voice rebounded in a disorienting hollow chorus that did nothing to fill the cavernous loneliness. Everything about this new environment felt hostile and alive, as though the darkness itself had a presence that pressed against him from every side. The cold rock walls and the unfamiliar labyrinth of passages reeked of ancient earth and stagnant air, assaulting his senses in a way that made each breath feel slightly more suffocating than the last. He realized with mounting horror that no one knew exactly where he was, since he had not told his wife about his spontaneous decision to deviate from his usual path. The thought of her at home, completely unaware that he was lying injured in a pit of blackness, made his chest tighten with guilt and fear. Determined not to let despair consume him, he crawled forward a few inches at a time, probing the jagged floor in hopes of finding a stable surface to rest upon. Every movement seemed amplified in the darkness, the scrape of stone on stone and the ragged sound of his breathing magnified in the eerie stillness. The floor felt damp in places, slick from a thin trickle of water that emerged from some unseen fissure in the cave wall, creating a subtle but ominous drip that measured time with cruel indifference. He tried to focus on that slow, rhythmic tapping as if it were a countdown urging him to act before it was too late. The thought of his wife's kind eyes and the sound of his children's laughter surged unbidden into his mind, kindling a flicker of resolve that cut through the oppressive gloom. He clung to their faces in his imagination as he carefully checked his limbs for any broken bones, exhaling in relief when he realized his injuries seemed painful but not immediately catastrophic. Though his ankle throbbed, he could still put some weight on it if he moved with excruciating slowness, and he refused to believe that a sprain would seal his fate. Yet doubt dug its claws into his thoughts, whispering that no one would find him in time, that even if they did look for him, he was buried too deep under rock and earth for search parties to stand a chance. He closed his eyes, trying to recall the exact layout of the ground above, but all he saw in his mind's eye was the memory of the swirling dust as he fell, accompanied by the sickening sensation of free fall that seemed to last an eternity. Sweat beaded on his forehead, cold and clammy, as he realized he had no rope, no flashlight, and only the faint, murky glow of refracted daylight high above, which was already dimming as the afternoon wore on. He gritted his teeth, refusing to let the terror fully take hold, focusing instead on the single truth that he had to survive for his family's sake. He thought about how his youngest daughter Anna had clung to his leg just that morning, begging him not to leave until he promised to be home in time for dinner. A sharp pang of regret stabbed him as he understood how deeply he had failed in that simple promise, lying here in the bowels of the earth while his family unknowingly waited. Still, the warmth of that memory spread through his chest, reminding him that his life was worth fighting for, that giving in to panic would only hasten a dreadful end. Slowly he began to scoot along the jagged ground, searching for any natural slope or opening that might lead him closer to the surface. The darkness was so total that it felt almost velvety, a suffocating blanket that threatened to lull him into submission if he wasn't constantly vigilant. Stones shifted under his palms, and more than once he nearly lost his balance when a piece of debris gave way beneath him, his heart leaping into his throat as he narrowly avoided plunging deeper into the cave. The dull ache in his leg throbbed in protest, but he forced himself to continue, whispering small reassurances under his breath as if to anchor his resolve in each painful shuffle. Occasionally he paused to call out once more, his voice growing hoarse from shouting, but he refused to give up the hope that maybe, just maybe, someone might be close enough to hear him. Each unanswered cry reminded him of the magnitude of his isolation, yet the silence also infuriated him, stoking a defiant anger he used as fuel to push forward. The faint circle of light far above had turned from a pale yellow to a waning gray, and though the cave remained perpetually dark, the lack of that faint glow made everything feel more ominous. The temperature seemed to drop along with his morale, and a deep shiver rippled through his body as he huddled against the unyielding rock, trying to conserve warmth. He forced himself to think logically for a moment, reflecting on the possibility that if there was water trickling down somewhere, there could be a network of small openings in the cave's ceiling or walls leading back to the surface. He reasoned that following the sound of dripping water might be his best chance to find an upward route, though he feared that an ill-advised move could bury him deeper in the labyrinth. The unrelenting reality of his situation pressed down on him from every direction, yet deep within his chest, a kernel of perseverance refused to be extinguished. The urgency of returning to his family kept flooding his senses, overshadowing the throbbing pain and the creeping despair. He realized that the bond he shared with his loved ones was his strongest armor in this fight against hopelessness, and he vowed to cling to that love no matter how dire his circumstances became. Gritting his teeth, he took a moment to test his injured ankle again, wincing but refusing to let a small jolt of pain stop him. Gathering what little energy he had left, he staggered upright, leaning against the rough cave wall for support, and began to feel for any kind of foothold. Tiny stones tumbled away with each shuffle, and his palms stung from the sharp edges of the rock, yet he focused solely on taking one cautious step at a time. The darkness made it impossible to judge depth or distance, so he relied on touch and hearing, occasionally pausing to let his eyes adjust to the minimal light that filtered in. A frustrated groan escaped his lips when his hand slid across a damp patch of slimy algae on the cavern wall, a grim reminder of how alien this subterranean environment truly was. Yet he pressed on, every muscle tensed, each sense heightened, fueled by the flicker of a thought that he could, by some miracle, find his way back to the people who needed him most. Every so often, a dislodged pebble would plummet into what seemed like a bottomless drop, its clatter echoing ominously until it faded into silence, forcing Thomas to inch back from the edge. The physical toll weighed heavily on him, his breathing ragged, his throat parched, and his heartbeat hammering in his ears like a relentless drumbeat. Time lost its usual meaning in that hushed cavern, where each minute felt simultaneously infinite and impossibly fragile. It dawned on him that if he succumbed to exhaustion now, there was no guarantee he would have the strength to continue once darkness fell completely, and he might not even be able to see the faint silhouette of that distant opening high above. He paused at a relatively flat section of rock, resting one shoulder against the wall and straining to recall everything he knew about wilderness survival. Realizing he had no matches or phone service, he felt a momentary surge of frustration at his unpreparedness, but he cast aside the self-blame, knowing it solved nothing. Instead, he reminded himself that his mind was his greatest resource, the one tool no abrupt fall could strip from him. Though his body was weakened, his thoughts were still his own to shape, and he determined then and there that he would not entertain the finality of defeat. The choice to believe in a better outcome, no matter how slim the odds, was the lifeline he clutched with every ounce of willpower. He focused on the mantra that if he could just keep moving, keep trying, keep believing, he stood a fighting chance of escaping this stony prison. Each labored breath became an affirmation, each painful step a testament to the unyielding desire to reunite with his family. Even the incessant drip of water turned into a rhythmic reminder that time was passing whether he acted or not, urging him forward to discover a path he refused to believe did not exist. By the time he finally sank to his knees, too exhausted to continue for the moment. His entire body trembled with a mixture of pain, hunger, and despair, yet his spirit clung to that single thread of determination. As he lay there, muscles quivering, breath rasping in the clammy air, he conjured the image of his wife's gentle smile, mentally replaying the sound of his children's voices as they raced through the living room in their endless games of hide-and-seek. This was more than a nostalgic recollection. It was his beacon of hope, the force that had already pulled him back from the brink. Though tears welled up in his eyes at the thought that he might never see those faces again if he failed, he channeled that despair into resolve, letting it galvanize his weary limbs for the next attempt. Even if no rescue team appeared above him, and even if he had to crawl inch by inch for days, he would not surrender while any trace of life remained in his body. The darkness might cloak him, chill him, and terrify him, but it could not claim his belief in the possibility that he might emerge into daylight once more. And so he sat there in the dim hush of the cavern, teeth chattering from cold, blood trickling from scrapes on his palms, heart aching with a longing so profound it was almost physically tangible, yet still clinging with unbreakable stubbornness to the conviction that he had the power to overcome. Thomas sat in the darkness with his back pressed against the clammy cave wall, every nerve in his body throbbing from a night of restless half-sleep, his mind cycling endlessly through the same suffocating thoughts that urged him to give in to panic. The realization that no one would find him by mere chance gnawed at him like a persistent ache, and each time he glanced upward at the faint, ghostly circle of light above, his stomach churned with the dread that it might vanish altogether if the clouds rolled in or if night fell completely. A familiar voice in his head taunted him, whispering that he was a fool for ever thinking he could find a way out, that this deep pit of earth was simply where his story would end. He tried to silence the voice by breathing slowly and deliberately, counting the inhales and exhales in a desperate attempt to cling to logic, but the darkness around him seemed almost to pulse with a threatening life of its own, feeding on every flicker of self-doubt. His thoughts drifted to the cozy living room at home, where a soft lamp illuminated the family photos on the mantel, and the contrast between that warm image and his current cold, stony tomb made him shiver with grief. A wave of anger surged in him as he pictured his children growing up without their father, but that anger quickly collapsed into despair, leaving him trembling with the fear that nothing he did would be enough to alter his fate. In an effort to fight back, he pressed his fingers hard against the rock beneath him, tracing the uneven surfaces as though searching for some clue or reassurance in the stone, yet all he felt was a lifeless chill that seemed to confirm his worst anxieties. He sensed his heartbeat thudding dangerously fast, a private metronome that marked each moment lost in this cavern, and he worried that if he let his pulse race too long he would hyperventilate and render himself even more helpless. Closing his eyes, he tried to picture his wife's face in as much detail as possible, recalling the small freckles on her cheeks and the subtle tilt of her smile, reminding himself that she was real, that life above ground continued spinning despite his entrapment here. That vision offered him a flicker of solace, but a mocking echo within his mind pointed out how useless imagination was if it failed to deliver concrete solutions, and again he felt the tug of despair pulling him under. He slumped lower against the wall, letting out a ragged exhale that seemed to carry the last of his resolve, then chided himself for giving up so easily, knowing full well that every second spent in self-pity was a second stolen from any chance he might have to escape. Each attempt to stand resulted in a stabbing pain in his ankle that nearly buckled him, and though he bit his lip until it bled, he could not entirely contain the groan that escaped his throat. He told himself this pain was proof that he was still very much alive, that while breath remained in his lungs, he had a responsibility to keep fighting, but the voice of doubt returned, relentless, reminding him that a living man could still die forgotten in a pit if he failed to overcome the odds. In the oppressive silence of the cave, even the faint trickle of water seemed more vivid than any human sound, and he felt an absurd jealousy of that water's freedom to move, to drip and flow unimpeded, while he was confined to a cold pocket of stone. With grim determination, he began to drag himself toward the sound, reasoning that wherever water found a way in, perhaps an exit existed, or at least a passage leading to higher ground. Yet every scrape of his body against the rough floor prompted fresh stabs of pain that multiplied, draining him of the energy he needed to sustain hope, and he nearly stopped several times when the inner refrain of, "This is pointless," grew too strong to ignore. When he finally arrived at the damp patch on the floor, he discovered only a narrow fissure in the rock through which water seeped, impossible to climb or expand, and that small dead end felt like the last straw snapping under the weight of his desperation. He let his forehead rest against the wet stone, tears mingling with the moisture as he clung to the rock like a shipwrecked sailor might cling to a broken mast, unable to decide if pressing on was an act of courage or blind folly. A wave of memory washed over him as he knelt there. A family vacation from years ago when he taught his oldest child how to swim in a calm lake, coaxing her to trust that even if the water seemed vast, her body was capable of staying afloat. That memory stung because it forced him to admit that he had been full of encouraging words and unwavering faith in her abilities back then, yet here he was now, unable to summon even a fraction of that same faith for himself. Still, he clung to the thought, breathing in the recollection of her bright, determined face, hoping it might serve as a balm for his bruised spirit. Even in the midst of this darkness, a subtle sense of responsibility took root, whispering that if he had once guided another soul to find confidence in the unknown, then perhaps he could turn those lessons inward. Thomas had always prided himself on being a reliable provider, but as he crouched against the cold stone, his body stiff from pain and his spirit on the verge of collapse, he realized how much he had taken that role for granted. He closed his eyes and tried to summon an image of his wife, a gentle woman with a hidden streak of steel that emerged whenever life tested her patience, and he pictured her leaning over the kitchen table, brow furrowed with worry at his unexplained absence. The longer he allowed himself to dwell on that scene, the sharper the ache in his chest grew, until it felt as though the very air in the cave weighed against his lungs like a physical burden. Thoughts of his children swirled in his mind, two lively spirits who had inherited their mother's resilience and his own spark of curiosity, and he imagined them bounding around the living room, playfully calling his name, unaware of his silent struggle beneath the earth. Even as exhaustion tugged at him, that simple envisioning of their bright smiles acted like a tether pulling him back from the edge of despair, reminding him that giving up would mean consigning them to an uncertain future without a father's guiding hand. He forced himself to recall the bedtime stories he used to read, how he would narrate tales of courage and adventure while his children huddled close under soft blankets, their eyes wide with wonder at heroes who braved impossible odds. An almost painful irony struck him then, for he now found himself in a scenario worthy of one of those daring adventures, yet he did not feel bold or invincible, only desperate and determined. That sense of desperation, however, was precisely what fueled him to keep his trembling body moving, to press his hands against rough walls in search of cracks or ledges, all the while telling himself that if fairy tales could teach children to trust and hope, then perhaps he could do the same in this unscripted nightmare. Flashes of memory gave him the strength to continue. The day his youngest child first learned to walk and clung to his fingers for support, or the afternoon he spent painstakingly teaching both kids how to ride their bikes without training wheels on a quiet neighborhood street. Each recollection served as a reminder that his presence mattered in their world, that his life was intertwined with theirs in countless ways, and that losing him would leave a void far deeper than any cave. He could almost hear his wife's voice urging him to stay safe, whenever he left for even the simplest errand, her concern now magnified tenfold by the unknown hours of his absence, a realization that simultaneously tore at his heart and bolstered his resolve. Even the recollection of small mundane moments, like the time they sat side by side on the sofa folding laundry, exchanging quiet jokes while the kids dozed off upstairs, suddenly felt monumental in its warmth, a stark contrast to the frigid darkness that enclosed him now. The knowledge that he was loved, truly loved, became a burning coal in his chest, an ember of willpower that refused to be snuffed out by the relentless gloom of the cavern. He let that ember guide him forward, each step fueled by the conviction that every scrape, bruise, and pang of hunger was but a temporary obstacle on the path to reclaiming the future he envisioned for his family. Guilt mingled with that determination, knowing that his decision to explore a new path on a whim had led to this dire predicament, but he vowed that if he survived he would never again take such blessings for granted. More than once he had to stifle the urge to collapse and simply succumb to tears, his body quivering from accumulated stress and fatigue, but the thought of his children's laughter echoed in his memory, banishing the temptation to surrender. His ankle sent jolts of agony through him whenever he tried to put weight on it, yet even this crippling pain seemed almost inconsequential compared to the anguish he felt at the idea of his loved ones calling his phone, hoping in vain to hear his voice on the other end. Every pause he took, pressing his forehead to the cold stone to gather his breath, offered a chance for the darkness to creep further into his mind, whispering that it was pointless to continue. But the echo of his wife's laughter in 1,000 cherished memories kept that insidious voice at bay. He remembered how not so long ago, the two of them had dreamed of saving enough money for a modest family vacation, a break from the daily grind of work and responsibilities, and the image of them all splashing around in the ocean under a warm sun reminded him that dreams still mattered even now. The mere thought of his kids building sandcastles with shrieking glee had a power so potent it nearly propelled him off his knees, flooding him with a fury against the cave itself for daring to hold him hostage. More than just anger, though, he felt a rising sense of protectiveness, as though by surviving he was safeguarding not just his own life but the countless days and years of love and support they all still had yet to share. He mumbled their names like a mantra as he continued to feel his way along the jagged edges of the subterranean walls, each syllable resonating through the cavern and reminding him of why he had to keep pushing forward. In the dim light that trickled down from an unknown source, he occasionally caught a glimpse of the scrapes on his arms, raw lines of red that spoke volumes of the determination fueling his every movement. Those wounds were evidence of his refusal to stay still, to accept the cave as his final resting place, and as his hand slid over a wet patch of moss, he realized there might yet be pockets of life and resources hidden within this underground world. The possibility of finding water he could drink, or even a series of cracks leading to larger openings, spurred him onward, his exhaustion briefly overshadowed by a spark of hope. He wondered if at this very moment his wife was on the phone with the authorities, describing his height and clothing, maybe even leading them to the entrance of that hidden cave, but he pushed the thought aside, refusing to rely on what-ifs when so little was guaranteed. The relentless desire to see his family again transcended all else, eclipsing even the primal fear that had gripped him earlier. And with that shift came a fierce sense of purpose that coursed through his veins like a second heartbeat. Nothing, he told himself, not the oppressive blackness nor the merciless echo of each stumbling step, could dim the light of that purpose, for it was born from a love stronger than the crushing weight of stone. If the only way out required crawling through every inch of this cave until he found an escape route, then he would scrape his hands raw and press on, fueled by the knowledge that a single miscalculation would rob his children of the father they deserved. Gradually, he realized that the emotional flame he carried had begun to burn away the cloying shadows of his earlier despair, leaving in its wake a crisp clarity about what truly mattered in his life. He promised himself under his breath that if he managed to escape this subterranean nightmare, he would embrace each mundane joy of life above ground as something precious, never again squandering an opportunity to hold his children close or share a quiet moment with his wife. The more he conjured thoughts of them, his daughter's expressive eyes and his son's boundless curiosity, the more he felt that the cave was powerless to steal his sense of identity, for his true self was interwoven with the family he refused to abandon. Each footstep, despite the shooting pains in his leg, became a testament to that unwavering bond, an unspoken challenge to the darkness, daring it to try to sever what love had forged. He found himself whispering lullabies he had sung when the children were infants, the simple melodies bouncing off the cavern walls, transforming a place of dread into a resonant chamber of determination. When his voice quivered from dehydration and fatigue, he continued the lullaby in his mind, a quiet beacon that guided him through each unsteady step. He envisioned his wife's look of stern relief whenever he returned late from work, her arms folded yet her gaze betraying the worry turned to gratitude, and he longed to see that look again to confirm that he had come home safe once more. Though his body kept reminding him of its frailties, each pang of thirst or flash of pain, he refused to let these signals dominate his awareness, preferring to focus on the intangible force of love that spurred him onward. He could practically feel the warmth of his children's hugs, the tiny hands grasping at his sleeve, refusing to let go, and he thought that was exactly how he must face this cave, with a relentless grip, unwilling to release his chance at life. The struggle, though monumental, felt less insurmountable when he considered that every scrape and bruise was a sign of progress, a sacrifice made in the name of a cause bigger than mere self-preservation. He wondered how many other people had faced such dire straits and found their loved ones to be the sole reason they emerged intact, and a hush of kinship with those unknown survivors settled over him. Even the shadows seemed to recede a fraction when he called his children's names, as if the cave itself respected the fierceness of paternal instinct that defied every obstacle. That was the secret heartbeat sustaining him, a rhythm that pulsed with the promise of reunion, urging him to keep digging his nails into the cracks of the stone, keep testing every rock that might serve as a handhold. He pressed the side of his face to the wall, letting the chill revitalize him, and breathed in the faint smell of damp earth with an almost reverent gratitude, for it reminded him that he was still here, still fighting, still clinging to life. The memory of his daughter's small hand gripping his index finger for balance during her first steps flickered through his mind, and he told himself that this cave was simply another stumbling block on the path of life, another moment where faith and determination would prove stronger than fear. In that instant he felt a surge of conviction that no darkness could outlast the love he carried within, and he allowed this belief to crystallize into an unshakable certainty that he would find a way back to them. Even if the search led him to countless dead ends or forced him to rest his aching limbs in the freezing gloom, he would persevere because the price of failure was a lifetime of robbed memories for the people he cherished most. When exhaustion wrapped its heavy cloak around his shoulders, threatening to drag him into oblivion, he remembered the contagious laughter that would erupt from his home whenever the kids got too excited, a joy so profound it was almost defiant in its exuberance. That memory became his lifeline, a shard of light in a sea of black, guiding him to steady his breath and refocus, inching toward any possibility of escape. He found that his sorrow now mingled with gratitude, for though fate had cast him into a harrowing test, it had also revealed the depth of his own capacity for love and the lengths he would go to protect it. With each passing minute he drew closer to the inescapable truth that while the cave's walls were literal barriers, his mindset could either imprison him further or elevate him to find the slimmest crack of hope in the ceiling. The knowledge that he had not come this far to fail seeped into his every thought, forming a stubborn resolve as solid as the rock under his feet. And in that resoluteness, he sensed that the power of his family's love would outshine even the darkest corners of the earth. Thomas rested his forehead against the damp rock, the cold pressing into his skin and reminding him that this was no ordinary challenge, but something that demanded an inner transformation if he hoped to survive. He shivered from a combination of exhaustion and the lingering chill that saturated the cave air. Yet somewhere deep within he sensed a quiet stirring, a faint spark that defied the unrelenting gloom around him. At first he could not name this glimmer of warmth in his chest, only that it made the darkness feel marginally less suffocating, as though he were not entirely alone in the fight against his own despair. He closed his eyes and let the flicker of possibility dance through his thoughts, remembering how as a child he once overcame his terror of heights by climbing the tallest tree in his grandfather's orchard, gripping each branch with shaky hands but refusing to surrender to panic. That memory of triumph, so distant and seemingly irrelevant now, nonetheless felt like a guiding thread, reminding him that fear had never completely defined who he was, even in situations that threatened to overpower him. The more he allowed these recollections to surface, snippets of times he pushed through doubt and astonished himself with small victories, the stronger that inner spark grew, forging a subtle shift in his mindset that could not be easily undone. It dawned on him that perhaps this stirring was a seed of belief, not just in the abstract concept of hope, but in his own capacity to shape fate through unwavering resolve. He pictured the faces of his wife and children, imagining how relieved they would be to see him walk through the front door, and that envisioned reunion felt less like a pipe dream and more like a tangible goal, something he could physically grasp if he dared to trust that it was possible. Each time he revisited that mental image, seeing his children's eyes light up and feeling his wife's arms wrap around him, it fanned the ember in his heart until it began to take on a soft, persistent glow, a counterpoint to the relentless darkness. He took several trembling breaths, realizing that this was how belief often starts, not as a roaring fire of certainty, but as the smallest spark that one must protect against the winds of doubt. The cave seemed to sense this change, its silence now less of a threat and more of a canvas upon which he could project the growing conviction that he was not defined by the walls that entrapped him. Even his throbbing ankle, which had felt like a prison shackle around his leg, took on a new significance, becoming a challenge to overcome rather than a sentence of hopelessness. He took a moment to shift his weight carefully, testing his limits, and though pain shot through his nerves, he refused to interpret it as a defeat. Instead, it was evidence he was still alive and capable of purposeful action. By reframing each hardship as a stepping stone rather than a dead end, Thomas discovered that his mind began to clear, no longer clouded by the worst-case scenario that loomed so heavily before. He knew the cave had not magically become less dangerous or the exit more certain, but he also sensed that a fundamental shift was happening, an internal pivot away from terror and toward a fighting chance. In this fragile state of dawning belief, he recalled an old saying he once heard: "Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet voice at the end of the day whispering, 'I will try again tomorrow.'" That sentiment resonated in him more profoundly than any grand gesture of heroism, for he recognized that true bravery did not have to shout. It only had to persevere. He steadied his breathing, easing his heartbeat into a calmer rhythm, letting the hush of the cave wrap around him like a cocoon in which this embryonic hope could grow. The word "believe" circled through his mind, and he clung to its every syllable, as though in pronouncing it mentally he breathed power into the darkness. Each subtle motion he made, whether running his fingertips over the stone, stretching his aching limbs, or gingerly testing his footing, became an act of defiance against the voice that insisted he should give in. He whispered to himself that if he could stand he could walk, and if he could walk he could search for a way out, and in that logical progression he found a delicate but real thread that connected him to the possibility of rescue. With each slow step, guided more by intuition than sight, he envisioned the day he would tell this story to his children, describing in careful detail how he learned that the darkness outside was nothing compared to the darkness within when hope was abandoned. He imagined their shocked faces, how they would likely cling to every word, and the mere thought of sharing this terrifying ordeal in a future tense made the idea of survival feel less abstract. No longer paralyzed by the thought that he might die alone in the bowels of the earth, he willed himself to take comfort in the notion that the world above had not vanished simply because he could not see it. Even the simple act of straightening his posture felt transformative, a physical manifestation of the decision to push back against the oppressive weight of hopelessness. He murmured a promise to himself that he would remain faithful to the tiny light within him, shielding it from the relentless gusts of fear, and that vow crystallized into a stronger, more sustained sense of determination. This was not a naive optimism. It was a careful, deliberate choice to acknowledge the danger while refusing to be governed by it. He remembered the countless times in his life when he had been tempted to quit something challenging, whether in his career, his personal goals, or even small tasks, and how each time he chose to persist, he discovered reserves of resilience he never knew he possessed. The cave, in its own way, seemed to challenge him to the greatest test of that resilience, as though it were an ancient entity whispering, "Prove that you can keep going despite every reason to crumble." He traced a hand over a jagged protrusion of rock, using it to brace himself as he inched along, and the simple fact that the stone was solid under his palm felt like a grounding force in the midst of so much uncertainty. Occasionally, his foot would slip on loose gravel, sending his heart racing, but he always managed to catch himself before sliding back into the deeper recesses below. Each time he regained his footing, a surge of adrenaline blended with relief, reinforcing that even near misses did not have to culminate in failure if he stayed alert and resourceful. He thought about how so many people drift through life underestimating the power of belief, taking for granted that they will never encounter a situation where their very survival hinges on their mental fortitude. Here in this underground crucible, he was learning that belief could be as vital as food or water, sustaining him when all else seemed lost. On several occasions when his legs felt like lead and his lungs burned with every breath, he questioned whether this path through the darkness was nothing but a labyrinth leading to nowhere. But then he would whisper his children's names and feel the ember of conviction glow brighter. That ember reminded him that no labyrinth was truly infinite, that nature had a way of forging tunnels and passages that often had an entrance and an exit, and his job was to keep searching until he found that one route to freedom. Thomas felt every muscle in his body tighten as he gazed into the deeper recesses of the cave, which seemed to sprawl in front of him with no definitive pattern or guide, daring him to discover the right path by sheer will alone. He brushed his raw, scraped palms against his sides and took a careful step forward, bracing himself for the jolt of pain in his injured ankle, which throbbed like a ceaseless reminder of his body's mounting limitations. For a moment he closed his eyes and tried to imagine himself far from this subterranean nightmare, perhaps strolling hand in hand with his wife down a leafy trail, or tossing a ball with his children in the backyard, before exhaling and accepting that his immediate reality demanded every drop of strength and concentration he could muster. The darkness pressed in from all sides, thick and suffocating, challenging him to maintain the slender thread of faith he had cultivated, even as the weight of doubt and fatigue threatened to smother it. With each new step he felt tiny tremors in his calves and thighs, as though his body were fraying under the strain, and he had to pause frequently, leaning heavily on the cold stone walls for support while he gathered the courage to continue. The sharp sting of jagged rocks cutting into his fingertips reminded him that he was still alive, still moving, even when every ounce of logic told him to collapse and surrender. Sometimes the cave would slope upward at a deceptively gentle incline, sending a hopeful thrill through him, only for it to veer sharply downward again or terminate in a jagged dead end that forced him to backtrack until his legs threatened to give out. The frustration of these false leads gnawed at his composure, tempting him to curse aloud at the unyielding walls that offered him no clues, but he channeled that anger into a renewed determination to push forward. Each time he encountered a particularly treacherous passage, a narrow ledge flanked by sheer drops on either side, or a slippery tunnel requiring him to crawl on his stomach, he paused to quell the rising panic that surged through his veins like fire. Instead of allowing fear to paralyze him, he began to reflect on moments from his past when he had faced obstacles that felt insurmountable at the time, recalling how perseverance, even when it seemed futile, had led him to small yet crucial breakthroughs. Clutching these recollections like precious artifacts, he used them to bolster his courage for each daunting stretch of rock, reminding himself that he had already survived the fall and the suffocating hours in this labyrinth. Surely he could handle one more step. Yet the physical toll of his ordeal was impossible to ignore. Every muscle quivered from overexertion, his stomach churned with hunger, and a bone-deep fatigue clung to him, threatening to lull him into a dangerous state of apathy if he lingered in one place too long. The throbbing in his ankle had intensified into sharp, stabbing pangs that erupted whenever he shifted his weight incorrectly, forcing him to bite back groans lest he waste precious energy crying out into the darkness. In that endless night, even the simplest tasks, like balancing on an uneven slope or sliding his body through a narrow crack, became monumental trials of endurance, each one a test of whether he could keep hold of his steadily fraying resolve. He realized how easy it would be to let despair coil around him like a serpent, filling his mind with accusations of his own helplessness and urging him to lie down and let the cave claim him. Yet in the midst of that slow, creeping dread, he discovered a wellspring of resilience fed by the promise he made to himself never to forsake the family who relied on him. He visualized how his children might react upon hearing the tale of his escape, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and admiration, and the idea of providing them with that story, of showing them that even the darkest journey can be overcome, rekindled his wavering hope. When he caught himself stumbling mentally, drifting into the possibility of defeat, he clenched his fists until his nails dug into his palms, using the pain as a jolt back to the present moment, where every heartbeat was an opportunity to choose perseverance over surrender. More than once he found an unexpected reservoir of strength simply by speaking aloud to the cave itself, muttering defiant vows that he would not die down here, that his loved ones needed him, and that not even the oppressive weight of stone could extinguish the bond that tethered him to the life above. As he inched along a precarious ledge, his heart hammering in his chest, the memory of his daughter's first words, how she babbled "duh," with a toothless grin, surfaced so vividly that he nearly lost his balance from the wave of emotion it unleashed. He took a moment to steady himself, tears burning at the corners of his eyes, and let that tender memory strengthen his grip on the unforgiving rock, affirming that this personal trial was part of a far larger tapestry of love and responsibility. Each time his body shook with fatigue and threatened to collapse, he would recite silent affirmations in his mind, reminding himself that his story was not over and that every test of will was a step closer to reuniting with the people who anchored his heart. The rhythmic drip of water, which once felt like a grim metronome ticking away his dwindling chances, now offered him a peculiar kind of company, reminding him that movement, any movement, meant life. Sometimes he paused just to listen for any faint echo that might indicate an opening or a new route, pressing his ear to the wall as though it were a living thing that might whisper directions if he remained patient and attentive. He found an odd consolation in thinking of explorers and adventurers from history who had braved unknown terrains armed with little more than determination, surmising that if they had found ways through jungles, deserts, or the frozen poles, then perhaps he could navigate this underworld of stone. Daylight remained elusive, and at times he questioned whether day and night even mattered anymore, given that the absolute blackness around him erased all sense of time, but he clung to the conviction that if the sun could still rise and set above him, then he could still climb toward it. He started to embrace small, practical strategies to combat the relentless exhaustion, like allocating brief moments to sit in a relatively safe spot, gather his ragged breath, and focus on the slow inhale-exhale that grounded him in the present. During these rests, he would gently probe his ankle, testing its mobility while trying not to fixate on the pain, reminding himself that though it was injured he could still walk, an undeniable sign that his situation, however dire, was not beyond saving. At intervals, he forced himself to sip the trickling water he discovered in cracks, placing his lips against the cold rock to catch even a few precious drops, aware that dehydration could render him delirious and strip him of his final lifeline of reason. The water tasted of minerals and earth, but it revived him in small increments, a testament to how even the cave's meager resources could become an ally if viewed through the lens of survival. He struggled to track how far he had come or how much time had passed, as memory blurred in the swirling haze of physical torment and mental strain, but he noticed that each difficult passage he overcame felt marginally less crippling than the one before. The raw determination he had been nurturing took on a life of its own, reinforcing his every step with a quiet conviction that he was indeed making progress, however incremental, and that each obstacle conquered was one fewer barrier between him and freedom. Occasionally he stumbled into pockets of the cave that seemed more expansive, the ceiling arching so high above that his echoes returned in an eerily resonant chorus, and he would stand there in the void, both exhilarated and fearful, wondering if this chamber was somehow closer to the surface. Though the meager light never grew bright enough to confirm the hope of an exit, each new chamber made him suspect that the labyrinth was not entirely random, that perhaps a route to open air did exist if he just kept searching. These moments granted him a surge of optimism that melded seamlessly with the bone-deep grit he had been cultivating, forging a synergy of hope and perseverance that propelled him onward like a second wind. Yet he also discovered that not all expansions of the cave were beneficial, as some opened onto treacherous pits that plunged farther into darkness, reminding him that one careless misstep could undo all the ground he had gained. More than ever, he learned to balance optimism with caution, for while he refused to let fear dominate him, he understood that staying alive required meticulous attention to every slippery ledge, every protruding rock, every subtle shift in the cave's floor. Deep in these winding tunnels, his own thoughts became both his adversary and his salvation, shifting unpredictably between moments of near euphoria, when he was convinced he could and would see the sky again, and flashes of numb despair in which he felt certain the cave would become his grave. Each time a wave of hopelessness threatened to spill over him, he anchored himself by recalling the promise he made to his family, that he would hold on to hope at all costs. He replayed their voices in his mind, as vivid as if they were right beside him, fueling his resolve and helping him see that he was not merely one man's strength but an expression of their collective love. It was in these solitary, harrowing hours that he realized the mind, more than the body, often determined whether a person would break under impossible odds or rise to meet them. Each fresh stab of pain from his ankle became a challenge to harness that mental fortitude, each stumbling misstep a reminder that the path to survival is rarely a straight line. Even the battered walls that tore at his clothes and scraped his skin served as signposts of a journey that tested every dimension of his being, physical, emotional, and spiritual. Sometimes he laughed softly in the gloom, almost delirious from fatigue, because he recognized how this entire ordeal had stripped away the trivialities and illusions of daily life, laying bare the primal truth that survival is an act of will as much as circumstance. Nothing felt more important than the next footstep, the next heartbeat, and the next glimmer of possibility that might guide him toward an opening in the rock, a breath of fresh air, or a sign that rescue was near. He was neither saint nor superhero, merely a man who refused to accept that his story would end in silence, buried beneath stone, and in acknowledging his own ordinariness he felt a quiet, resolute pride that blossomed into something like valor. The more he pushed against his physical and mental limits, the more he sensed that the cave itself was indifferent, a silent monolith unconcerned with whether he lived or died, and that realization freed him from resentment. He stopped cursing the darkness or blaming the cold for his misfortune, choosing instead to see the cave as a harsh teacher that compelled him to unearth layers of resilience he had never before tapped. With each slow, measured step across a rocky ledge or down a sloping corridor, He abandoned old assumptions about his limitations and replaced them with a raw acceptance of his capacity to endure. The deeper he ventured, the louder his heartbeat seemed, a rhythmic drum fueling his determination, as if it were chanting a single refrain. Keep going, keep going, keep going. At times he found himself whispering back, I'm still here, as if asserting his existence against the monumental quiet, staking his claim on life amidst a realm that seemed designed to erase him. The synergy of belief and grit became more potent than any painkiller, helping him shoulder the agony that roiled through his ankle and limbs, letting him envision a moment when he would step into the daylight battered but not broken. And so he advanced, piece by agonizing piece, forging a new relationship with each bruise and scrape on his body, wearing them as proof that he was strong enough to break through obstacles that might have destroyed him had he allowed despair to take root. Every time fear would rear its head, urging him to freeze and conserve his energy, he let the memory of his family's love supersede that dread, using the fierce determination in his heart to eclipse the panic in his mind. In those darkest corners of the labyrinth, where even his own breath sounded ominous, he discovered the faintest glow of something that transcended the physical realm, an inner light powered by a blend of resolve and a sense of destiny urging him to keep fighting. He promised himself that no matter how daunting the road ahead, he would not leave this world with the question of, what if I had tried harder, gnawing at his soul. Though his body grew weaker by the hour, his spirit, refined by the ceaseless trials, glowed ever brighter, fueling the final reservoir of courage he would need to attempt the greatest feats of climbing and crawling that lay in wait. Each fresh challenge, whether a precipitous cliff inside the cave or a harrowingly narrow passage, served as a crucible that tested and fortified his will, bonding him ever closer to the faint but unwavering sense that he was edging closer to freedom. As the hours stretched on, he found himself whispering not just words of encouragement, but fragments of gratitude for the resilience blooming within him, a resilience he might never have discovered if the cave had not forced him to confront every raw edge of his being. The synergy of agony and hope crystallized into a single driving force that propelled him onward, breath by ragged breath, step by stumbling step, convinced that somehow at the end of these tunnels, a sliver of light and the embrace of his family awaited him. Thomas felt a trembling sense of anticipation building within him as he limped into a section of the cave that seemed marginally less cramped than the twisting tunnels he had spent countless hours navigating, a space where he dared to hope he might finally glimpse a sign of liberation. He paused, pressing his palms against the slick rock to steady himself, inhaling the cold subterranean air until he could sense his heart beating in a more controlled rhythm, an internal drum urging him onward. Though his ankles still pounded with every step, he found that the combined force of hope and stubborn resolve was enough to mask some of the pain, as though his body understood that the end of this odyssey was near. Looking up, he detected the faintest sheen of light playing across the distant ceiling, not strong enough to illuminate his surroundings fully, but unmistakable in its contrast to the pervasive darkness that had nearly become his norm. For one long moment he closed his eyes in disbelief, half convinced he might be hallucinating, yet when he opened them again the ghostly radiance remained, beckoning him like a lighthouse guiding a weary sailor through treacherous waters. Straining to see the source, he moved forward with halting steps, forcing his battered arms and legs to comply despite the tremors of fatigue, and a low, unsteady exhale escaped his lips as he realized he might be on the threshold of his final trial. He wound around a cluster of stalagmites, carefully stepping over loose gravel that threatened to send him tumbling back into deeper darkness, each careful footfall resonating in his mind like a declaration that he still lived, still fought. Every so often he turned his head to the side, ears poised to detect any rumble of shifting earth or echo of distant rescue teams, but only the dripping of water and the soft shuffle of his own movements greeted him, underscoring that this final push might depend solely on his own strength. His spirit, however, was no longer the fragile thing it had been in the early hours of his entrapment. It had been tempered by trials that forced him to reach inside himself for reserves of grit he never knew existed, forging a steadiness that steadied each step. Memories of his family, once a painful reminder of all he stood to lose, now filled him with a fierce determination that surged through his limbs, knitting together his belief that a future beyond these cavern walls was not just a dream but an imminent reality if he could hold on a bit longer. He could practically hear his children's excited voices urging him on, their imagined shouts of encouragement echoing off the cave walls in place of the dreaded hush that had haunted him. As he approached the source of the light, the narrow path widened into a chamber much taller than any space he had encountered thus far, the rocky ceiling stretching up like a cathedral vault, etched with shimmering veins of mineral deposits that sparkled in the faint glow. The sound of water intensified, gushing rather than dripping, and though he initially worried the chamber might be flooded, he soon realized a natural waterfall tumbled along one side, sending a fine mist into the air. Weak as he was, the sight of rushing water energized him, reminding him of life, movement, and freedom, and he staggered toward it, eager to see if it hinted at an opening beyond. Carefully he approached the waterfall's edge, gripping the slick stone to maintain his balance, letting the mist cool his fevered skin, and when he peered upward through the cascade he saw a thin beam of daylight slicing through an overhead crevice. That luminous shaft, though narrow, appeared to lead toward the surface, forming a tunnel-like opening that water had carved over countless years, and he felt a tremor of awe as he recognized the chance it represented. With his heart pounding in his throat, he leaned forward to assess the climb, noticing the slick rocks that formed a kind of natural ladder beneath the flowing water, each step glinting under the faint but insistent light. The challenge was clear. To scale this makeshift ladder he would need to brave the torrent and trust his battered body not to falter on the precarious footholds, risking a devastating fall if he slipped. For a moment, fear twisted in his gut, conjuring visions of him crashing downward into the dark pool below, bones shattering, hope extinguished, but he forced that image away, remembering the countless obstacles he had already vanquished. Summoning every ounce of will he had left, he slid his fingers along the wet stone, testing for stable grips, and found that while the water made the surface treacherously smooth, certain grooves and indentations might support his weight if he moved slowly and deliberately. Drawing a long, shuddering breath, he placed his injured ankle on the first ledge, wincing as pain surged through him like lightning, but he did not retreat, instead clenching his jaw and hauling his body upward. He fought the pounding waterfall, which splashed against his face and half-blinded him at times, causing him to sputter and choke as he tried to keep a firm hold on the rocks, his muscles quivering under the constant force. Each time his foot slipped, he felt adrenaline spike, fueling a desperate surge of strength that he funneled into regaining his balance, wrestling with the wet stone in a life-or-death dance. In those terrifying seconds he refused to let fear take root, focusing instead on the faint glow above, telling himself that with each inch he ascended, the promise of fresh air and an open sky drew nearer. He inched upward, step by agonizing step, arms shaking from the sheer effort, every muscle screaming in protest, and yet a strange exhilaration coursed through him, buoyed by the thought that he was scaling the final barricade between himself and freedom. The roar of the waterfall grew deafening, the spray soaking him to the bone, turning every breath into a gasp for air, but he pressed on, heart thundering in his chest, visions swimming from equal parts exhaustion and euphoria. Memories fluttered through his mind in quick succession. The tears in his wife's eyes on their wedding day, his son's triumphant squeal the first time he rode a bike without training wheels, the tender way his daughter brushed a bandage over a small cut on his hand, treating him like a brave patient. These recollections felt like a choir of voices cheering him on, reminding him what waited for him if he conquered this final test. Time warped, moments stretching out in a blur of water and stone, until at last he felt the space above him open further, allowing a sliver more light to pour in, and his breath caught in his throat. He extended his arm as high as he could, fingers groping blindly until they found a narrow edge, a ledge that felt more stable than any he had encountered thus far, and he pulled with trembling might. With a final surge of will, he hoisted his upper body onto a small outcrop, pressing his cheek to the cold rock and exhaling in a choked sob of relief, for he had reached a spot just beyond the main torrent. Though his legs dangled precariously, he braced his shoulders against the tunnel's side, inching sideways until he could wedge himself into a cramped but safe position, free from the direct onslaught of water. The beam of daylight was stronger here, revealing a narrow fissure that angled upward, and he realized with a dazed mixture of disbelief and triumph that he could see glimpses of the outside world through that slender gap. Summoning the last remnants of his energy, he gritted his teeth and began clawing at the opening, widening it piece by piece as small stones and debris rained down around him, the air around him alive with the echo of his frantic movements. Eventually he managed to squeeze his shoulders through, wincing as sharp edges cut at his skin, but refusing to let any pain stop him, the taste of freedom overpowering any momentary discomfort. Heart pounding, he wriggled like a trapped animal, pushing, twisting, and contorting his body in ways he never would have believed possible, until he felt the rush of cool air against his face, an intoxicating sensation that nearly brought him to tears. With a final desperate lunge, he slipped through the fissure and into a small clearing on the surface, collapsing onto damp grass in the brilliant glow of late afternoon sunlight that blazed across his eyes like a benediction. For several seconds he could do nothing but lie there, panting, his lungs drinking in the fresh air, while the warmth of the sun felt like a tender embrace after the merciless cold of the cave. Tears streaked his grime-smeared cheeks as he raised his head to take in the sight of a wide, open sky flecked with soft clouds, a vista he feared he might never see again. A raw cry, half laugh and half sob, escaped his lips as he realized he was alive, that he had defied the crushing dark that once seemed so absolute, and he let the triumph wash over him in tidal waves of relief. The grass under his fingertips felt impossibly soft, a reminder of all the simple miracles of life above ground that he had taken for granted, and he found himself mumbling a prayer of gratitude to whatever forces had guided him through the labyrinth below. Though every muscle in his body ached and his ankles screamed for rest, a flood of joy coursed through his veins, fueling a sense of invincibility he had never before tasted. He pictured his wife's reaction to his emergence, the tears of relief that would likely mirror his own, and he could almost feel his children's small arms wrapping around his neck, their voices quick and excited with questions. He knew he was far from fully safe. He still needed to signal for help or find his way home, but the worst was behind him, a fact that cast the entire world in a radiant new light. Limping to his feet, he surveyed his surroundings, noticing how the forest canopy swayed gently in a breeze that felt like a long-lost friend, as the sun's rays illuminated every leaf, each one more vibrant than any memory of green he carried. His throat constricted with emotion as he reached for a broken branch to steady himself, thinking how inconceivable it was that such a simple living place coexisted so close to the pit of darkness he had just escaped. Every movement stung, yet it also filled him with a sobering realization that this pain, this mixture of triumph and suffering, was a testament to the unimaginable resilience he had discovered within himself. He forced a shaky grin as he turned toward the direction he suspected might lead him to a familiar trail, each step on this uneven terrain feeling like an affirmation that he had conquered his own demons alongside the natural obstacles. As he hobbled through the grass, leaves crunching underfoot, he inhaled deeply, letting the perfume of living soil, warm pine, and distant wildflowers chase away the last vestiges of the cave's musty odor that clung to his clothes. Though he still winced every few paces, he felt unstoppable in a way that transcended mere bravado, a confidence anchored in first-hand knowledge of just how far a determined spirit could travel when fueled by love and the unquenchable fire of belief. Staggering uphill, he imagined the moment he would catch a glimpse of civilization, perhaps the faint outline of a dirt path or a stray footprint, and how that would confirm his ordeal had truly ended. Each breath seemed lighter, each passing second a fresh chance to marvel at the simple freedom of being able to choose his direction, his destiny, rather than be dictated by the cruel corridors of a subterranean maze. Though the shadows of tree trunks occasionally reminded him of the claustrophobic darkness below, he pressed onward, knowing that any lingering fear could never again hold the same power it once did, not after all he had conquered. At last he caught a glimpse of a familiar rocky outcrop in the distance that looked like the place he originally slipped, a towering reminder of how quickly an ordinary day could turn to disaster, yet also an emblem of the extraordinary capacity for survival. His mouth set in a thin line of determination, he quickened his hobbling pace, no longer dwelling on the pain but on the simple, astonishing fact that he was still walking, still breathing, still able to determine what came next. A swirl of gratitude rose in him, and he whispered his family's names as though speaking a sacred incantation, promising them that he would be home soon, a vow that resonated with far more certainty than any he had made before. When he reached a vantage point overlooking the path below, he raised a hand to shield his eyes from the golden light bathing the land in a serenity that contrasted sharply with his recent ordeal, and he felt a surge of awe at how ordinary yet sublime the world could be. Everything from the branches overhead to the distant call of a bird seemed infused with renewed meaning, as if the cave had forced him to strip away every trivial concern and see life for the miraculous gift it truly was. Even though the day was waning with soft shadows stretching across the forest floor, He relished each moment, convinced that if he could survive that labyrinth, he could face whatever challenges lay ahead with the same tenacity. Leaning against a broad tree trunk, he allowed himself a moment's respite, closing his eyes and letting the light breeze caress his face, reliving the final climb through the waterfall in a rush of images and sensations that still coursed through him like electricity. The recollection of his initial terror intertwined with the triumph of each foothold found, weaving a tapestry of hope, fear, and steadfastness that would forever alter how he viewed obstacles in his life. Ultimately, he understood that the cave had changed him in ways he could hardly articulate, stripping him down to his core and revealing layers of strength and faith he had only barely suspected existed, proving that true victory often arises not from ease but from the crucible of adversity. He opened his eyes, letting them rest on the softly lit horizon where he believed his home lay waiting, secure in the knowledge that he would soon stand face to face with his loved ones, regaling them with a story that testified to the unbreakable power of the human spirit. Despite his injured ankle and weary limbs, his heart felt ablaze with the knowledge that he had reclaimed his freedom through sheer belief, guided by the unwavering love that compelled him to resist the clutching arms of hopelessness. With careful deliberation, he started down the slope that would lead him closer to civilization, pausing only to look back once at the rugged landscape that concealed the entrance to the underground cavern, a silent farewell to the shadows that had both threatened and transformed him. Then, with a renewed sense of purpose, he turned his gaze forward, letting the sun's final rays light his path, heart full of gratitude for the second chance at life he had seized by conquering the cave's dark depths. Thomas's ordeal did not conclude the instant he staggered into the sunlit clearing. Rather, it reverberated through every subsequent moment of his life, imprinting on him the knowledge that true power arises not from physical might but from the unyielding flame of self-belief. He returned home battered and limping, yet the embrace of his family carried a warmth that healed him far more thoroughly than any salve could, and in their tearful hugs he discovered a deeper understanding of gratitude. As he recounted his descent and eventual escape from the cave's clutches, he found that each retelling crystallized the lessons he had gleaned in the darkness, chiefly that belief in one's own capacity to endure can illuminate even the most harrowing paths. Gone were the subtle complacencies of everyday life, those rote habits that once dulled his appreciation for ordinary miracles like a warm meal or a safe bed. In their place blossomed a reverence for the simple blessings he had almost lost forever. Though his ankle continued to ache for weeks, each twinge reminded him that pain is both a warning and a teacher, urging us to evolve rather than retreat. Friends and neighbors listened to his story with wide-eyed astonishment, drawn in by the vivid account of a man who had wrestled with despair in the bowels of the earth and emerged stronger in spirit, if not in body. He noticed that even the children, including his own, clung to the moral that unshakable resolve can outmatch even a realm of suffocating gloom, and they began to see him as a living testament to the power of perseverance. In truth, he often felt undeserving of their awe, recalling countless moments when terror had almost wrestled him down, and yet it was precisely his willingness to confront that terror that transformed him from a victim into a survivor. He spoke openly of how it was not a singular burst of courage that saved him, but a steady accumulation of tiny affirmations, moments where he chose love over despair, where he saw possibility rather than a tomb of stone. The more he emphasized the role of positive thinking and unwavering belief, the more he came to embody those principles in his daily life, infusing mundane tasks with a newfound sense of purpose. Rather than fear the unknown, he embraced life's spontaneous challenges, mindful of the day he had discovered that a shift in perspective was sometimes all that stood between entrapment and liberation. His wife, once accustomed to his subdued nature, found him invigorated with a quiet dynamism, as though the near-death experience had peeled away his self-imposed limitations, revealing a man who truly understood that each breath was a privilege. Even on nights when he startled awake from nightmares of endless tunnels, sweat slick on his brow, the memory of that first gulp of fresh air upon emerging reassured him that darkness could be pushed back if one dared to believe. Over time, he helped those around him see how belief need not be grand or theatrical. Sometimes it was as simple as refusing to succumb to the small defeats that accumulate in a cynical world. In this humility, he found not weakness but resonance with everyone who faced struggles of their own, from academic hurdles to chronic illness to deep-seated fears of failure. By sharing his story, he offered both caution and hope, caution in recognizing how swiftly life can plunge one into unforeseen crises, and hope in illuminating the extraordinary courage that ordinary individuals can muster when love and determination intersect. His children, once too young to comprehend real danger, now looked upon their father as a blueprint for resilience, a walking emblem of how intangible qualities like faith and resolve hold tangible power. Although he occasionally downplayed his own fortitude, the heartfelt letters and calls from people who heard of his experience proved that personal belief has a ripple effect, inspiring others to nurture their own hidden reservoirs of strength. In remembering the depths of that cavern, he recognized that victory hinged on a simple decision to keep trying when giving up would have been easier, and from that realization grew a lifelong commitment to foster optimism wherever he went. He volunteered for local search and rescue efforts, driven by the desire to repay the gift of survival he had received and to stand by anyone trapped in the bleakest corners of existence, whether literal or metaphorical. Each time he ventured into unfamiliar territory, part of him flashed back to the raw helplessness he once felt, but he no longer let that dread define him, trusting instead in a refined instinct that believed adversity could be transcended. It was, in the end, the power of belief, rooted in love, sharpened by necessity and sheltered by persistent self-talk, that guided him through the labyrinth of despair and into a future brimming with possibility, proving that even the most profound darkness bends to the unbreakable light of the human spirit. Thomas emerged from his ordeal carrying a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet confidence that eclipsed the terror he had once faced deep within the earth. Every labored breath under the open sky reminded him of how perilously close he had come to losing everything, and he now understood with startling clarity that his belief in a better outcome had been more than mere optimism. It had been his lifeline. In the days that followed his escape, as he rested his injured ankle and recuperated, he found his mind often drifting back to those hours of darkness, recalling how a single spark of hope had gradually blossomed into an unbreakable resolve. He realized that while the physical act of scaling jagged walls and enduring endless corridors demanded raw endurance, it was his mental focus and unwavering faith in the possibility of rescue that ultimately carried him through each impossible stretch. Long after the bruises faded and the cuts began to heal, he continued to trace in his thoughts the path he had crawled, climbed, and stumbled along, marveling at the intensity of that visceral struggle. He spoke to his wife and children about the moment when he had nearly given in to despair, and how thinking of their voices and laughter had reignited his will, proving that love and faith can be powerful co-conspirators in even the most harrowing trials. In sharing his story with friends and neighbors, he recognized that many of them also wrestled with internal caves of self-doubt or fear, hidden as they might be, and he discovered that his experience shone a light on the universal power of mindset. The courage he found was not born from bravado but from a heartfelt promise he had made to his family, one that refused to be silenced by the oppressive weight of stone above him, and he took solace in how that promise became a beam of strength in the blackest recesses of the cavern. Belief, he realized, is as much a discipline as it is a feeling. A deliberate choice to reject the finality of hopelessness, even when every logical sign points to surrender. Just as crucial was the recognition that positivity does not deny the danger or pain of a situation. Instead, it harnesses the human spirit's innate capacity to outshine the darkest night. After his rescue, Thomas approached daily life with a heightened gratitude for simple joys. The warmth of the sun on his face, the taste of fresh water untainted by minerals and fear, and the comforting buzz of normalcy in a world that had seemed permanently out of reach. He found himself pausing to appreciate laughter and conversation, to hug his children a little tighter, and to hold his wife's gaze a little longer, cherishing the small miracles that once slipped by unnoticed. Strangely, he discovered that the memory of the cave did not haunt him with nightmares but instead served as a touchstone for resilience. A reminder that if he could endure the darkest literal prison of earth and stone, he could face life's metaphorical shadows with equal tenacity. He remained ever mindful that belief by itself cannot eliminate obstacles, but it can give a person the fortitude to push back against limitations, finding footholds in the slippery terrain of the impossible. When doubt resurfaced in quieter moments, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts, he revisited the raw desperation of his underground struggle, recalling how each pulse of fear had been countered by a deeper resolve not to let his story end there. He came to see that belief and positive thinking are not naive wishes for a charmed outcome but active forces that ignite courage, shift perspective, and sustain a fierce devotion to seeing a goal through. Over time, his story evolved into a lesson he shared freely, that no cavern is as vast or hopeless as the prison of one's own surrendered heart, and that the surest way to breach that inner darkness is to cling steadfastly to the bright threads of faith, love, and determination. The wounds from his journey healed, but the growth they inspired remained, woven into the fabric of how he approached each new day and challenge. He often told his children that the cave had taught him life's greatest truth, that hope does not merely light the path, it forges it where none seemed possible. In embracing this truth, he recognized that every human being carries within them a quiet but indomitable power, one that can transform sheer impossibility into uncharted opportunity. His humility deepened, yet he also walked taller, imbued with the knowledge that true bravery arises not in the absence of fear, but in daring to move forward despite it. All around him, people who heard of his rescue discovered a spark of courage to confront their own hidden caves, whether they were built of failure, rejection, or self-doubt, illustrating the ripple effect of one person's decision to believe. With each retelling of his harrowing experiences, Thomas felt gratitude swelling in his chest, realizing he was no longer merely a husband and father but a living testament to the power of holding on to a singular, unwavering conviction. In this transformation, he finally grasped that just as a single beam of light can pierce the deepest darkness, a solitary seed of belief can flourish into a mighty force, reshaping what seems unchangeable and illuminating the path toward a victorious end.